أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار يا حي يا قيوم برحمتك أستغيث لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني. Today I'll be discussing a few aspects of neuroscience in regards to philosophy and of course the Quran and Hadith. There are a handful of things I would like to mention which are diverse, however very supportive, often contrasting and to a degree corresponding with the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These are ideas I have been reading on a lot recently. One of my favorite areas in neuroscience is the neuroscience of perception and vision and the concepts that exist within the paradigm of understanding perception and vision from a philosophical angle and from a neuroscientific angle. So today we are going to explore a handful of things. As I mentioned, the neuroscience of vision, the deliberation system, we'll be covering that from his book, and the binding problem of consciousness, which is a big debate when it comes to nature and nurture. Likewise with psychological nativism, innateness, touching on empiricism as well, and the modularity of the mind, and also just touching on the free will and habit system that human beings have, both the cognitive side and the Islamic perspective when it comes to habits. So, before I begin, an ayah of the Quran really struck me, and this ayah began this particular journey of mine of neuroscience and philosophy of vision and perception. So, from chapter 67, verse 23, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الذي أنشأكم وجعل لكم السمع والأبصار والأفئدة قليلا ما تشكرون. صدق الله العظيم. This approximates to English as, say your Prophet, He is the one who brought you into being and gave you hearing, sight and intellect, yet you hardly give any thanks. This is very much true, and I'm sure all, if not most of us, can definitely relate to. So, taking a jump back in history, one of the original editions of this book, The Self and the Brain, by Karl Popper and John Eccles. Karl Popper was a Fabian philosopher of the Fabian Society, a very dark society here in London. And he wrote this book with the neuroscientist John Eccles. But when I was reading on the topic of conscious perception, right, this quote really struck me. And this is by another neuroscientist from the 70s named Mountcastle. And he said the following regarding conscious perception. Each of us believes himself to live directly within the world that surrounds him, to sense its objects and events precisely, to live in a real and current time. I assert that these are perceptual illusions, for each of us confronts the world from a brain linked to what is out there by a few million fragile sensory nerve fibers. These are our only information channels, our lifelines to reality. These sensory nerve fibers are not high fidelity recorders, for they accentuate certain stimulus features and neglect others. The central neuron is a storyteller with regard to the afferent nerve fibers, and he is never completely trustworthy, allowing distortions of quality and measure within a strained but isomorphic spatial relation between outside and inside. Sensation is an abstraction, not a replication of the real world. Much can be said about what Mount Castle has mentioned, and subhanallah, there are some truths to what he said here. Not going to be focusing on what he said in particular, but the main subjects he has brought up, such as outside and inside realities, spatial relation or spatial temporal relation is what I'll be covering. I will also take into account one of my favorite philosophers, Immanuel Kant. Favorite because he's very difficult to read and I like to challenge myself. And along with this, the idea of perception when it comes to objects and events, and how a general perspective in terms of neuroscientific processes and cognitive frameworks come to play. And then, of course, you have unique abstractions that all of us have. For instance, when we see a landscape, we see the contours, we see the structures, the colors, the sounds, we perceive the sounds, and the sensation of the air when it hits our skin. So these cutaneous perceptions, along with the other senses and along with our inbuilt knowledge and the knowledge that we construct from what we take into our eyes and therefore projected in our brain and stored in our mind, is all essentially a culmination of our being and how Allah has created us. Yet we do not give gratitude and we are not thankful to Allah for these abilities He has put in us. Some have more abilities than others, not saying there is a social hierarchy in terms of a eugenics or a colonial sense, but there is a hierarchy within the Islamic paradigm of some individuals knowing more than others, some are more talented than others, and this is a fact. No one can run away from this. So, first and foremost, I'd like to briefly break down the typical visual system. So, when light hits our eyes, it strikes the retina, right? And the retina, from this point onwards, converts the light that enters into electric signals, and this hits our primary visual cortex, also known as the striate cortex, also called the V1 area. Now, within the V1 area, the neurons that exist are uniquely organized into a structure called ocular dominance columns, and these are alternating bands that receive input separately from each eye. So one of the chapters I will take this screenshot from, which you can now see on your screen. This gives you an idea of what the structure is, and from picture number B you can see how a section is taken from the layer 4 of the V1 cortex of a monkey. I believe these were neural monkeys in this particular study and this example. And looking at picture B, I could only imagine fingerprints of human beings, how unique fingerprints are. Every single one of us have unique fingerprints. Even twins, monozygote or dizygote twins, don't even have the same fingerprints. So this perspective pushed me and compelled me to go into a deeper dive in terms of ocular dominance columns and understanding the visual hierarchy. As we spoke of hierarchy shortly before, this is a slightly different hierarchy because this is more structural, this is more top down in a sense, okay? And so first and foremost, we have the V1. The V1 detects edges and contrast in our environment. V2 and V3 detects motion and depth. V4 and the IT cortices recognize objects and faces. But what we see is actually a prediction. It's a projection to a degree of the environment around us. Is it what we see is not actually what it is, according to neuroscientists and neurophilosophers. From Islamic paradigm, this depends on the condition of your heart. That's why the Quran reiterates on many occasions that it's not the eyes but the hearts that are blind. And to a degree it makes sense because the brain perceives and the heart interprets what is being perceived. We now know there are thousands, I believe up to 40,000 neurons discovered around the heart. In fact, there's a whole area in neuroscience called neurocardiology. Neurocardiology is looking and studying the neurons that surround the heart and around the area of the heart. So what's fascinating is also that there is a hadith regarding this particular aspect of looking at the visual system and understanding how humans interpret things. And just after this hadith, I'll like to expand on ocular dominance columns that are very, very interesting, simply because the nature of these neurons. So the hadith of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is, beware, there's a piece of flesh in the body. If it becomes good, the whole body becomes good. If it gets corrupt, the whole body gets corrupt. And that piece of flesh is the heart. So the heart plays a very central role in Islam. So ocular dominance columns, these were first discovered by Hubel and Wiesel. Hubel and Wiesel have been quoted in this book I have mentioned earlier, The Self and Its Brain. And there's a interesting picture I like to share with everyone here. And on your screen you can see the discovery of said ocular dominance columns, and this study was actually done on monkeys by Hubel and Wiesel, and they say that these particular neurons are essentially stripes of neurons in the visual cortex in certain mammals, monkeys and humans, right? And they respond preferentially to input from one eye or the other. So it could be the left or the right, and this could be the contralateral or the ipsilateral regions, right? And the columns span multiple cortical layers. So as I showed on the previous from the previous picture from the same chapter, there's another interesting image I like to share here, and this is showing you the various layers and how the colors that are perceived once light enters into our retina, hits the V1 area and hits these neuronal layers. Very fascinating. And they are laid out in a stripped pattern across the surface of the V1, and the stripes lie perpendicular to the orientation columns. Orientation columns is a different area, but briefly speaking, they are organized regions of neurons that are excited by visual line stimuli of different angles. So these columns are located in the V1 as well and span multiple cortical layers. And I will attach a picture now so you can see where the V1 is exactly in the brain, and you can also have an idea of where it is on your own head. So ocular dominance columns, they were very important back in the day. So I'm talking about the 60s and 70s to understand cortical plasticity. And what they found is that monocular deprivation causes columns to degrade, and with non-deprived eyes assuming control of more of the cortical cells. So what that means is that monocular deprivation is an experimental technique that we neuroscientists use to study central nervous system plasticity. Generally, it's when one of the animal eyes is shuttered shut during a period of high cortical plasticity, and these findings were actually done with the cats. But going back to where all of this started from, this is what the image is from the paper by Hubel and Wiesel, and you can see the amount of detail they went into when looking at this. So Hubel and Wiesel also again studied the visual cortex structures in cats, and so ocular dominance columns, they've been found to be present in ferrets and monkeys and humans, and they are also absent in many animals, by the way, such as rats, because they have binocular vision. So extremely fascinating area, and the more I speak about it, the more it makes me emotional, because how Allah has created this very small aspect that I, with my limited knowledge, I'm managing to explain in as much detail. And so this is essentially the idea of the most textbook, the most basic vision system we have, and also ocular dominance columns being one of those neurons, one of thousands of them, right? So moving on from here, once our brain processes color in one area and shape in another and movement in another, but somehow this experience seems to be unified into one. All this information and data that's coming in seems to be unified in one, and we can describe things in one sentence. For example, if you see a red apple on a table, you are able to describe in a sentence or two that description, that particular picture that you're seeing, simply based off of a depiction that's in your mind, processed, and then through linguistics and language processing, you're able to say, on the table lies, or on the table is sitting, or upon the table is a fresh red, white apple, black table, so on and so forth, right? So, but how does the brain, how is it able to do all of this? Well, one of the ideas that exist is called the binding problem. Now, one thing everyone can agree is conscious experience. We all have conscious experience. Without that, none of what's happening right now, me recording this so you're able to see it and you having the ability to perceive and understand and digest everything I'm saying is impossible without a conscious experience. However, the consciousness and binding problem is a problem of how objects, background, abstractions, shape, form, and emotional features are combined into one single experience. And the binding problem refers to the overall encoding of our brain circuits for the combination of decisions and actions and perception. It's also considered a problem because no complete agreed upon universal model exists in the world of neuroscience. So it's been divided in many different areas, and it's been subdivided into perception, neuroscience, cognitive science, neurolinguistics, and philosophy of mind. So it includes general aspects such as coordination and the subjective unity of perception and variable binding, as well as the hierarchy of the visual system, as I briefly outlined, and also how, for instance, color affects cognition as well. So all in all, it's an issue that has been worrying scientists for a while. And to give an idea of where this problem stands at the moment, there's a researcher called Feldman who I came across who actually speaks of this. And just to quote one of the aspects of his findings summarized here is: attention is crucial in determining which phenomena appear to be bound together, noticed, and remembered. The specific binding problem is generally referred to as temporal synchrony. At the most basic level, all neural firings and its adaptations depends on specific considerations to timing. At a much larger level, frequent patterns in large-scale neural activity are a major diagnostic and scientific tool. Now, a key thing I would like to highlight here is the following: that when it speaks of neural firing and adaptation, when it comes to specific consideration of timing, there is an idea that stories that are heard and sensed have a particular effect on our neurons being fired in sequentially, and subsequently evoking particular emotions. That's why, for example, when we watch a film or come across an ayah of the Quran and come across particular stories from the past, we have a particular emotion that's ignited within us, and a similar sentiment is shared with someone else. So how does that happen? Is it because there's an innate sensation or some form of innateness within us, or is it a build-up of things we observe and hear and we are able to perceive? The answer is we don't know in terms of neuroscientists. But from an Islamic point of view, there is a strong indication that it is, without a doubt, universal. How are these sentiments universal, and how are these sentiments same across all human beings? Well, there's an ayah from the Quran which pinpoints this, and this is from chapter 50, Surah Al-Qaf, and this ayah in and of itself speaks volumes. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولقد خلقنا الإنسان ونعلم ما توسوس به نفسه وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ. Sadaqallahu al-Azim. So this in English approximates to as, indeed it is we who created humankind and fully know what their souls whisper to them, and we are closer to them than their jugular vein. So Allah is even closer to us than our jugular vein. Jugular vein is used as an example, and it's one of the largest veins that exist from our head brain area down to our heart. So this is quite fascinating that Allah would give such an example, and allow us to ponder and consider this. So the way I actually saw this, and the way I was trying to understand this also, was, how can it be that a particular issue that is bothering neuroscientists, and most of them are agnostic and atheist, are unable to solve this one basic issue, the how all of this data we're getting in is being unified. And as I mentioned earlier, neural synchrony, where brainwaves firing in sync, this area as well, many studies have been done, but how is this happening? Okay, so from here I decided to try and find a philosophical concept of intrinsic unity of perception and self-awareness beyond just neural processes and neural activity and studies looking at monkeys and cats, right? So I stumbled across Immanuel Kant's concept. So Immanuel Kant, he believes that humans have a priori knowledge, so something that already exists, and from that which already exists we are able to theorize and compartmentalize and contemplate the world around us. So concepts such as time, space, and causality exist within our mind. So there is a study that I've mentioned before, and this study blows my mind every single time, and that also makes my hair stand, which is that babies within their mother's womb move their head as a byproduct of lasers being shone on their mother's womb in a 3-point laser-like structure, similar to a face structure, 2 eyes and a mouth. That's the idea. And this movement is consistent with these babies, and this study was done from the UK, and I'll attach the article on the screen. It's incredible. It's absolutely mind-blowing how such a thing happens. So there is an indication of innateness in that aspect. However, I would like to read out the idea of space and time, which all of this is happening. Okay, without space and time, none of these concepts can be contemplated. In fact, none of us would exist without space and time. So I have here Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. This is a 1993 Everyman's Library edition. And so I would like to read section 1 on space from the chapter Transcendental Aesthetic. I'll show it here on the camera as well. Transcendental Aesthetic, and this is the portion on space and time. So Kant says, By means of the external sense, a property of the mind, we represent to ourselves objects as outside us, and these all in space. Therein alone are their shape, dimensions, and relations to each other determined or determinable. The internal sense, by means of which the mind contemplates itself or its internal state, gives indeed no intuition of the soul as an object, yet there is nevertheless a determinate form under which alone the contemplation of our internal state is possible, so that all which relates to the inward determinations of the mind is represented in relations of time. Now this is an interesting rhetorical question coming up. Of time we cannot have any external intuition, any more than we can have an internal intuition of space. What then are time and space? Are they real existences, or are they merely relations or determinations of things, such however as would equally belong to these things in themselves, though they should never sorry, just lost the page here. Or are they merely relations or determinations of things, such however as would equally belong to these things in themselves, though they should never become objects of intuition? Or are they such as belong only to the form of intuition and consequently to the subjective constitution of the mind, without which these predicates of time and space could not be attached to any object? In order to become informed on these points, we shall first give an exposition of the concept of space. By exposition, I mean the clear, though not exhaustive, representation of that which belongs to a concept, and an exposition is metaphysical when it contains that which represents the concept as given a priori. So, space is not an empirical concept which has been derived from outward experiences. For in order that certain sensations may relate to something outside me, that is, to something which occupies a different part of space from that in which I am, in like manner, in order that I may represent them not merely as outside of and next to each other, but also in separate places, the representation of space must already exist as a foundation. I agree. Consequently, the representation of space cannot be borrowed from the relations of external phenomena through experience, but on the contrary, this external experience is itself only possible through the said antecedent representation. So space has to exist prior to our experiences, and without this, none of the experiences are possible. Even we have some internal representation of an object, space is needed to have that internal representation to exist and come up and be conjured up in the first place. Point 2. Space then is a necessary representation a priori, which serves for the foundation of all external intuitions. We never can imagine or make representation to ourselves of the non-existence of space, though we may easily enough think that no objects are found in it, and must therefore be considered as the condition of the possibility of appearances, and by no means as a determination dependent on them. Right, and this is a representation a priori, which necessarily supplies the basis for external appearances. So space then is a necessary representation a priori, which serves for the foundation of all external intuitions. Pretty straightforward. Point number 3, space is no discursive, or as we say, a general concept of the relations of things, but a pure intuition. For in the first place, we can only represent ourselves in space, and when we talk of diverse spaces, we mean only parts of one and the same space. Moreover, these parts cannot antecede this one all-embracing space as the component parts from which the aggregate can be made up, but can be thought only as existing in it. So, coming back to the binding problem here, and psychological nativism, which, by the way, I'll explain in a moment, so Kant is saying here that parts of something cannot be the antecedent to an object. The object has to exist, and an analysis of parts come after, because space being a priori allows such parts to exist, such the whole to exist, and for us to embrace and sense this space, and this information aggregates in a sense we are able to perceive. So psychological nativism, okay, is the concept that is the view that certain skills or abilities are native or hardwired into the brain at birth, and this is the opposite of the blank slate aspect, where the brain is completely blank and there is no trace of any intelligence. Therefore, the brain has inborn capabilities for learning from the environment, but does not contain contents which can constitute innate beliefs. And this factor contributes to, again, the nature versus nurture argument. And it's again very much contentious as well, because again nativism seems very vague. It seems to be falsifiable, as there is no fixed definition. No one can agree on one framework, one definition. And when an ability is being difficult to explain, scientists just label it as innate. So a famous researcher named Ellman wrote on this, and he simply states that it's exactly unclear how supposedly innate information might actually be coded for in the genes. So one paragraph I found interesting in this particular text was that the authors say that nativism, and I'll attach this on the screen, nativism and empiricism give the same answer to these questions, okay? And the structures are not new, they pre-exist either in the organism or in the environment. So constructivism offered a very different view, considering the development in terms of self-organizing emergent structures arising from the complex interactions between the organism and the environment. And if you remember, I also wrote about this and recorded on neuroconstructivism. Inshallah, I'm going to make a better video, because I personally was not satisfied because of some editing issues, but inshallah we will make a better video talking about neuroconstructivism. And one of the authors of the book, Smith, she's also neuroconstructivist. So it's interesting how these paradigms are constantly shifting. To take Thomas Kuhn's idea, how new findings and new learnings and new inclinations as well come to existence by virtue of advancements in technology, thought, so on and so forth. So going back to Kant, space is essentially one and multiplicity in it. Consequently, the general concept of spaces depends solely upon limitations. Hence, it follows that an a priori intuition, which is not empirical, lies at the root of all our concepts of space. Thus, moreover, the principle of geometry, for example, that in a triangle, two sides together are greater than the third, are never derived from general concepts of line and triangle, but from intuition, and this is a priori with apodictic certainty. So when something is apodictic means something that is generally agreed upon without any dispute. So for example, in Islam, it's agreed upon without any dispute that we are going to pray 5 times a day minimum, and we perform Hajj when the situations and finances allows us in our lifetime. We will fast for a whole month during the month of Ramadan, and there will be 2 Eids in a year. Eid al-Fitr, which comes after Ramadan, and Eid al-Adha, which is during the months where pilgrimage is made, and also it's a indication of the testament of faith when a sacrificial animal is is given in the way of Allah. Not that Allah needs an animal to be sacrificed, but it symbolizes the incident also that Ibrahim alayhi salam had done with his son. So yeah, these generally agreed upon terms do exist, but the issue is when empirical science meets a non-reductionist point of view, then obviously you fall into trouble. But you're in deeper trouble when Allah is completely out of the picture. So, last point here by Kant. Space is represented as an infinite given quantity. Now, every concept must indeed be considered as a representation which is contained in an infinite multitude of different possible representations as their common characteristic, which therefore comprises these under itself, but no concept as such can be conceived as if it contained within itself an infinite multitude of representations. Nevertheless, space is so conceived for all parts of space, even to infinity exists at once. Consequently, the original representation of space is an intuition a priori, not a concept. So, space is not a concept, is what Kant's saying. It's an innate disposition we have. Not making a correlation here, but personally I think the study of where the fetuses move themselves once they see light, they already know they're in a confined and limited space a priori, and their ability to turn around also is a priori, because that requires, again, conscious effort, conscious experience on part of the child in the womb. It's my thoughts. Next is time. So Kant's perspective on time are just as fascinating as well. Time is not an empirical concept, for neither coexistence nor succession would be perceived by us if the representation of time did not exist as a foundation a priori. Without this presupposition, we could not represent to ourselves the things that exist together at one and the same time, or at different times, that is, contemporaneously or in succession. I agree. Time is a necessary representation lying at the foundation of all our intuitions. With regard to appearances in general, we cannot think away from the time and represent them to ourselves as out of and unconnected with time, but we can quite well represent to ourselves time void of appearances. Time is therefore given a priori. In it alone is all reality of appearances possible. These may be all annihilated in thought, but time itself as a universal condition of the possibility cannot be annulled. That is true. That is true. I mean, time as a universal condition of possibility cannot be annulled. You cannot neglect the element of time in anything we do. And it's the limited amount of time we have in this dunya on planet Earth that determines the infinite reality, the actual reality with a capital R, which are the day of judgment, the torment of the grave, the raising of the human beings on the day of judgment, and when we all gather at the plain of Arafah and we are judged and our accounts are given either to our right hand or in our left hand. And chapter 69 of the Quran, Surah Al-Haqqa, speaks about this in great detail. For those who are interested in Islamic theology and the Islamic concept of how Allah decides righteousness and evil and what will happen to those who are righteous and to those who are evil, chapter 69, in my humble opinion and view, is a fantastic and great starting point to understand these key tenets of the Day of Judgment and life after death. Right, next point. Coming back to Kant. On this necessity, a priori is also founded the possibility of apodictic principles. Again, apodictic means clearly established, agreed upon, beyond any dispute. Of the relations of time or axioms of time in general, such as time has only one dimension. Different times are not coexistent but successive, as different spaces are not successive but coexistent. Question is, the jinn, for example, the unknown entities, the unknown in terms of human beings not able to perceive them directly. Do they have concept of time? 6 o'clock at night, 9 o'clock in the morning, so on and so forth. Multidimensional or successive? I disagree with Kant here. There are multidimensional concepts of our reality for sure. Not concepts, sorry, realities, multidimensional realities of our reality. These principles cannot be derived from experience, for it would give neither strict universality nor apodictic certainty. We should only be able to say, so common experience teaches us, but not, it must be so. They are valid as rules through which in general experience is possible, and they instruct us respecting experience and not by means of it. So experience is not the means, but experience is the instruction. It instructs us in terms of approaching certain general conclusions, from what I've gathered. Time is not a discursive, or as it is called, a general concept, but a pure form of sensible intuition. Different times are merely parts of one and the same, but the representation, which can only be given by a single object, is an intuition. Besides, the proposition that different times cannot be coexistent could not be derived from a general concept, for this proposition is synthetical and therefore cannot spring out of concepts alone. It is therefore contained immediately in the intuition and representation of time. Right, so Kant is saying, from the a priori reality of time, from that comes the proposition that different times cannot be coexistent, and this cannot derive from a general concept, because concepts, according to Kant, are synthetic to the degree that a human mind has to work on determining if this concept is true or not, for instance, or if this is a concept that can become a rule and therefore lead to a law. So time is very, very much contested, really. Subhanallah. And verily man is at loss. Wal asr. Innal insana lafi khusr. The infinity of time signifies nothing more than that every determined quantity of time is possible only through limitations of one time lying at the foundation. Consequently, the original representation, time, must be given as unlimited. But as the determinate representation of the parts of time and every quantity of an object can be contained by limitation, the complete representation of time must not be furnished by means of concepts, for these contain only partial representations. Concept, on the contrary, must have immediate intuition for the basis. So yeah, before concepts come into play, there has to be intuition regarding that concept to even exist. And time has to be infinite in order for finite experiences and finite objects and finite concepts and laws to exist. So I pray, inshallah, that you see Kant's aspect, which is very similar to that of the Islamic paradigm. And, you know, with time, people change. With time, their ideas and even their personalities to a degree change. However, every single child is born with a fitra, and it's the environment that influences the child, which can be positive and negative, which can be enlightening and polluted. So a well-known hadith I would like to share of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that every child is born upon the fitra, the natural disposition, and then his parents make him a Jew, Christian, or a Magian. So this idea does make sense, that we are born with an innate cognitive and moral framework, as per what Muhammad has mentioned. And from here, one of the most profound questions are we truly free to make decisions, or are we simply creatures of habit, right? So at this point, I would like to introduce a researcher that has definitely influenced my interest in neuroscience and the neuroscience of navigation, decision making, and perception. Aaron David Reddish. He has written this book, The Mind Within the Brain, How We Make Decisions and How Those Decisions Go Wrong. And he has a concept that he calls deliberation. So the idea that we deliberately do something does exist, and the fact that behind those deliberate actions we have motivations, we have ideas, we have certain preconceived notions which are innate, and on the other hand those will argue no, they are constructions by virtue of our environment and how the organism reacts and forms a relationship with the environment. For example, neuroconstructivism. So chapter 9 of the book, Deliberation, right here, I would like to read some pages and inshallah give more insight into this incredible idea of how studying the neuroscience of decision making and perception allows us to understand how habits are formed and what is required for habits to form, and how we can unlearn certain aspects. From an Islamic point of view, we definitely can. For instance, I never really used to pray in my teenage years. Even in my 20s, never took it serious. Quran was abysmal. I'm still improving my tajweed, but now I'm at a point where it's intuition that I need to get up, do wudu, go to the mosque and pray, and need to read some Quran every single day. So these are habits that you eventually build. Of course, some bad habits may still exist, but you overcome them anyway with doing it little by little by little. In fact, there's a hadith of Muhammad ﷺ that the most beloved of deeds to Allah are those that are done consistently, even if they are small. So Islam teaches us that good habits strengthen our faith, while bad habits corrupt the soul and therefore blacken the heart. So, going to chapter 9, Deliberation. Some decisions are made explicitly by imagining the potential consequences of that decision. This imagination process is particularly good for decisions that cannot be learned slowly over time, or for major decisions that require a large upfront commitment cost. Deliberation is a computationally expensive process that requires a number of neural systems, including attention, imagination, and evaluation processes, and as such takes time to calculate which action to take. Deliberation entails the sequential serial search through possibilities, and that also entails space and time. It entails a prediction of what would happen if, followed by an evaluation process and an action selection process. This means that deliberation requires a host of complex processing. This complex processing makes deliberation incredibly flexible. Knowing that a path leads to an outcome does not imply that one must take that path to that outcome. So again, how do I know, for example, disobeying Allah will lead me to a bad path? Well, the Quran speaks of such path. In fact, the Quran opens up with Siratul Mustaqim, the idea, not even the idea, sorry, the reality of following the right path. And for those who become, for instance, ex-Muslims, so-called ex-Muslims, just another word for atheists and those who don't take religion or God serious, they will eventually know the outcome of the path they've chosen. Again, chapter 69 of the Quran speaks about this. But also makes deliberation slow, meaning it takes time to do all that computation. So knowing which path to choose requires a lot of thinking and also doing. So we already make a prediction in our mind by virtue of imagination and attention and evaluation. Deliberation also requires a knowledge of the structure of the world, particularly the cause-effect structure. Again, this coincides with Kant's concept of space and time. If you can't predict, you can't search through those predictions. Deliberation requires imagination. Deliberation requires one to be able to construct possible features and a process to know that those potential futures, to construct possible futures and a process to know that those potential futures are imagined and not real. Meaning that the inability to differentiate imagination from reality is, of course, a key component of several psychological disorders such as schizophrenia. Deliberation also requires an active memory process capable of remembering what paths you've searched through already and what paths are still left to explore. When comparing options, you need to be able to keep multiple options, their evaluations and their paths to them in your head. By attending to specific pros and cons, one can manipulate the evaluation. This requires a process called working memory, in which concepts are held in an active processing loop. So, working memory keeps ideas, concepts, and results easily accessible for immediate processing. Famous researchers are Badley and Atkinson, who've done work in this area, and Eddie de Havillier as well, who I had the pleasure of being taught by. The complexity and the mechanisms that allow working memory are a very large topic and are the subject of multiple books. Right, so by attending to specific pros and cons, one can even manipulate the evaluation. This requires a process called working memory, in which concepts are held in active processing loop. I just repeated it so you can, and in fact so I can understand this better. The cognitive map and declarative memory. The concept of the cognitive map was introduced by Tolman in the 30s. Tolman suggested that both rats and humans maintained a map of possibilities. This means that learning didn't have to be aimed at getting rewards and avoiding punishments, as suggested by B.F. Skinner and Clark Hull. They were behaviorist researchers, and I speak about this in my article From Crawling to Certainty, how Tolman's findings were very, very influential and groundbreaking as well. Tolman's concept implied that it was worth it to an animal to learn information about the world, even if that information didn't immediately lead to a reward or punishment. Information about the world could be used in future directions, making basic information a worthwhile pursuit itself. In modern neuroscience, the cognitive map is usually described as if it is a spatial map, but Tolman's original concept was more cognitive than map, and more modern interpretations of cognitive map are closer to the concept of schema about the structure of the world. Certainly, one of the most important things to know about the structure of the world is where things are and how the spatial world is connected. So, just like to add something here, and that is very true. Knowing how the world and the spatial world around us is connected is very, very, very important, because as Kant mentioned, that it seems to be time is an a priori reality and space is also in the same category, simply by virtue of the fact that these are needed for us to determine what we are experiencing. So the shape of the hill, the contours of the ground upon which we are standing and observing the hill. For an example, the light that is being emitted by the sun, the radiance, therefore, that's reflected in the sky or refracted if it's raining to form a rainbow. All these concepts have to be connected. Knowing that there are skyways connecting the building my office is in and the mail room will be very useful today when it's going to be 2 degrees Fahrenheit outside. But it is also part of the cognitive map to know that one can check the books out of a library and therefore one doesn't need to buy them. And to remember a friend's phone number, or that one can call 911 in an emergency, such as in the US. Or, for example, that Paris is in France and Tokyo is in Japan, and that New York is on the east coast of the US and San Diego is on the west coast. All of this knowledge about the structure of the world forms your cognitive map. If you've already learned these facts, you can use them to search through options to find the choice you want to make. These facts are sometimes referred to as declarative because they are things that can be declared. If I tell you that Tokyo is the capital of Japan, or that I grew up near Washington DC, but that I live in Minnesota, you know those facts. You don't need to practice them. In contrast, I can tell you how to throw a baseball or ride a bike or play the piano or clarinet, but to become any good at it, you need to practice them. Okay? In the memory literature, these are other skills called procedural because they require memories of the process and procedural rather than facts. So, for instance, I can describe to you how salah, prayer, is beneficial, it's good for your body in terms of stretching and in terms of calming your nerves, as the phrase goes. However, in order to perfect this particular process, the things have to be stored in memory. The postures, the supplications, the chapters of the Quran you have to recite, and all of this is done in harmony by a series of processes that are procedural. A has to follow B and then C. C cannot begin and A and B follow. It doesn't work like that. For example, in Salah, you cannot start your Salah and go into sujood directly. There's a portion of this process called the ruku. The ruku is important prior to the sujood, and when you stand up from ruku, rafa yadain is also important, which for some reason many do not do. Again, that's a sectarian-esque side of Islam, which unfortunately exists. I'm not going to go into that right now, but the idea is that declarative memory, reciting a chapter of the Quran in that respective and particular posture during prayer, is important, which neuroscientists call procedural memory. Now, declarative memory is often divided into 2 subcategories: semantic memory and episodic memory. Semantic memory entails the facts and knowledge about the structure of the world, right? For example, that apple is red and is on a table. Episodic memories are the memories of your own life. So this could be the first time you had an apple was when you were 5 years old at home. Your mom cut up some apples and you decided to eat them. Or she fed you. So that's episodic memory, for example. The statement that at my 6th birthday party my parents made me a cake in the shape of a rotary dial phone is a semantic memory. My memory that my dad said I had to wait to get the last piece because my initials were in the center, presumably trying to teach me to be polite and let my guest have cake first, and that I snuck my finger in and ate off the initials while my dad was serving a piece to someone and then demanded a piece of the cake since I had already got the letter, is an episodic memory. It's an interesting thing. So dad saying wait to have this portion of the cake because it has your initial. In this case, I assume the author ate that initial and wanted the cake. So the opposite of delayed gratification. So this is very fascinating how we are able to learn and build these ideas in a hierarchical structure. Okay, and it's very fascinating that scientists are able to put these concepts forward, and for me at least, I have able to get, as the years have gone by, become more and more closer to Allah and understand the Quran from a very unique and particular angle. So the key evidence that animals, including humans, use a cognitive map in making decisions is a process called latent learning. Learning about the structure of the world may not show up in behavior until one needs to call up that knowledge. Tolman's initial hypothesis came from observing rats running mazes. Rats with experience on a specific maze, just exploring with no rewards on the maze, would subsequently learn much faster than rats with no experience on the maze. The experiment that finally convinced Tolman that animals had to remember knowledge about the structure of the world was that a rat who was neither hungry or thirsty was allowed to explore a Y-shaped maze with food on the left fork and water on the right, would immediately go to the left fork when made hungry and to the right fork when made thirsty. For humans at least, this latent learning is about the cause and effect. We recognize this knowledge in terms of if and then rules. If I drop this glass, it will break. If I drop this plastic bottle, it won't. Therefore, it is safer to give a plastic bottle to my 3-year-old daughter since she may well drop the glass. Fair enough. We can think of deliberation as having 4 parts. Number 1, the knowledge of the world. Number 2, the search process using that knowledge of the world to predict what will happen. Number 3, an evaluation process measuring how good the outcome is, and an action selection process to actually take the step forward. So in this book, it's further broken down into search, evaluation, and action selection. So highly recommend chapter 9. Now I would like to touch upon the basal ganglia, which is very important when it comes to various actions that we do. And the basal ganglia are intricate structures that exist in our brain, and these structures are not exactly multimodal, but they do play various roles, right? So the basal ganglia, they are a group of structures that control voluntary movement and other functions like learning, memory, and emotion, something we've covered so far. And they are located in our forebrain, deep beneath the neocortex, right? And these structures, to give you some names, the group of structures, they are the substantia nigra, and also the thalamus, the striatum, and the globus pallidus. And these main structures in unison together are able to form the basal ganglia group of subcortical nuclei. So very, very complex area of the brain. In my opinion, one of the most complex, but they play a very key role, right? And they assist and aid us in maintaining posture and balance, as well as correct movement from when we, again, travel through space and time. Again, hopefully you see how space and time are constantly playing a role here, right? And without it, we are unable to function. I'm not saying it's the same as oxygen and blood, but what I am asserting here is that space and time are needed, and these are concepts that already exist within us a priori, although Kant goes a step further, saying that without them, none of the experiences, realities would make sense. And in fact, Schopenhauer further briefed them into causality. He said, yeah, this is causality. So fascinating to know when, philosophers step into these ideas of science. So the basal ganglia is, as I mentioned, one of the most complex areas, and speaking about habits, it also plays a role. So chapter 10 of this book, I'll touch on this as well. With enough experience, action selection becomes cached or stored in stimulus-response pairs and response-action chains. The advantage of this system is that it can respond quickly and reliably with the same action sequence every time. The disadvantage of this system is that it is inflexible and is slow to change in response to changing conditions, right? So poets often refer to us as creatures of habit. In the morning, we get up at the same time, we drink the same coffee or tea in the morning, eat the same cereal, and so on. In the evening, we want our book or our television before bed. We have all developed our own habits over the course of our lives. These habits are not instincts. They are not genetically programmed into us. So here you can see already Professor Reddish is going against what constructivists are seemingly positing, that the innateness is not exactly the final answer. There is a certain view where there is a certain possibility, actually, conceptually called constructivism, and this is where the organism again develops a relationship and with the environment, and this allows us to understand how self-organization emerges from these complex interactions and how structures are formed within our being. So instead, habits develop out of reliability. We'd like to think habits develop out of what we've individually found to be most useful to our lives, but of course we all have habits we like to break. Why do we develop bad habits? Where do habits come from? What are habits? What does the route we drive to work? Why does the route we drive to work becomes a habit, but the route we drive to the airport not? Interesting. Again, I think it's the case where small actions eventually formulate and become that habit. So fundamentally, habits are sequences of actions that we've learned to take. Exactly what I just said. The simplest example of a habit is the drive to work. The first time you drive to work, you need to use a map, follow a GPS, pay attention to the route you want to take. But if you drive the route every day for weeks, months, or years, you eventually stop paying attention to it. You drive yourself to work even as you are thinking of something else. This suggests the usual trajectory of learning. Flexible, deliberative mechanisms predominate early in learning, while inflexible, habit-based mechanisms develop with experience. Of course, control can also shift back from habit to deliberative systems. When the 35-watt bridge that was the primary conduit across the Mississippi River through Minneapolis collapsed in 2007, traffic had to be rerouted through the city. This changed the flow of traffic along my route to work, and I found that the route I normally took to work was much slower than it had been. So I found a new route, which actually turned out to be faster, even once the new bridge was built and reopened. This new route requires turning left at a certain intersection. Yet, even years afterwards, if I'm not paying attention, I continue straight at the intersection. Particularly if I'm thinking about something else, like a test I have to write or a scientific problem, or even trying to remember that I have to pick up milk on the way home from home after work. I go straight through. What's interesting about this is that no matter how distracted I am with my thoughts, I have never run the red light. I have never failed to brake in time, and I have never hit another car at this intersection. Even though it's a very crowded intersection, my brain is driving reliably, but I'm not paying attention to it. So you can probably tell by the author's personal experience how rerouting his way to work after a bridge collapse turned out to be faster, and he took the same route, and eventually it was second nature, as they say. So, basal ganglia. The circuitry in the basal ganglia is very complex, as I mentioned. We will spend some time exploring it in this chapter, but briefly, there are two pathways through the basal ganglia. One encourages actions and the other inhibits actions. Actually, there are three pathways through the basal ganglia. The third one stops learned action. We will return to this pathway in chapter 15 in our discussion of self-control and overriding of learned action. So there are three actions that the basal ganglia is responsible for. One encourages actions and the other inhibits, i.e. stops actions, and the third one is stops a learned action. So here is a pathway of the basal ganglia. I will now begin describing it and discussing it, and attach a picture on the screen so you can also follow what I am speaking of. So, pathways through the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia are a subcortical circuit that learns to control motor actions. There are three pathways through it. Number one, the first is a direct path, in which the cortex excites the striatum, which inhibits the internal globus pallidus, GPI. So you can see the line, the direct path here in the cortex, which excites the striatum. So the direct path, which is go, and this goes into the striatum, meaning it excites it, and this inhibits the GPI, the internal globus pallidus. Because the global pallidus internal neurons are tonically firing, inhibiting them releases thalamocortical and subcortical motor circuits. Okay. Number two is an indirect path. So here you can see where it says no-go. An indirect path adds an intervening inhibitory step, external globus pallidus, the GPE, which creates a triple negative. Okay, so it's inhibition upon inhibition upon. Okay. Number three is, the third is hyperdirect pathway. Okay, so you can see where it says stop in the diagram, in which the excitatory subthalamic nucleus, the STN, increases firing in the global pallidus internal, which stops actions. Learning occurs in the striatum through the dopamine inputs coming from the ventral tegmental area and the substantia nigra pars compactica. So you can see on the far right of this diagram this internal process of habit formation and the decision making, how it forms in the brain. This is a very general and very textbook idea of the basal ganglia. Personally, this is an area that I find complex, not only because of the routes and the pathways, but also the amount of hormones involved, such as dopamine and testosterone and others. So very, very fascinating, and subhanallah, without this, it's basically impossible for us to understand from a neuroscientific point of view how these decisions are made. So at the end of it all, we have looked at and explored various concepts of the brain's visual system, the binding problem, nativism, touched on the philosophical aspects, and also looked at time and space and free will in terms of decision making and habit formation, and of course looking at the Quran and the Hadith of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This video's aim was to ignite interest when it comes to neuroscience and philosophy, and the fact that we Muslims must step into these areas and do more research. That is one of my life's work, inshallah, as time goes on, no matter what happens. And for those who are interested, I write articles frequently on medium.com. Simply search Mind Matter Meaning and you can find stuff on there. Till next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.